Let me begin with a story about Harry. We'll call him Harry. Harry is a young Christian in his early 20s, and he's on his way to church one rainy morning in his two-seat sports car. Yet as he's driving down the road, he notices three of his fellow parishioners waiting at the bus stop. They too are on their way to church, but they're all having to huddle under this one umbrella as the rain is coming down. The first of these parishioners is Ethel Stewart, lovely old lady who's been a stalwart of their church for over 70 years. Next to her is Dr. Brown, who's been Harry's family doctor since before Harry was even born. And thirdly is Brianna Moore, a very godly and attractive young 21-year-old whom Harry has been interested in for quite a while now, but hasn't been able to build up the courage to talk to her yet. Now, he's only got one seat in his car. So what does he do? Well, he pulls up at this bus stop. He gets out and goes around and helps lovely old Ethel into the passenger seat, hands Dr. Brown his car keys, and huddles under the umbrella with Brianna, quietly praying the bus is late. Now, I tell that story because our passage today is about wisdom. Our topic is wisdom. And look, while wisdom and understanding are considered synonyms, they have very similar meanings, they actually are slightly different. So, the Hebrew word for understanding, and this is the word that comes up in our passage today, the Hebrew word is bina. And bina basically refers to the knowledge of how something works. So if you were to get a new smartwatch, for example, you would want to bina to understand how you use it. All right? The Hebrew word for wisdom is chokhmah. It's a different word. And chokhmah refers to putting your understanding into practice. So once you've figured out how to use your new smartwatch and what it was for, wisdom would tell you not to use it to hammer in nails. All right, that's the point of wisdom. And herein lies the importance of wisdom because, look, there are some decisions in life that are just clear-cut. Okay, we just know what to do. So take, for example, there was a lady that stopped me in the street this week and asked me directions to the local train station. Now, what do I do at that point? Well, I could start by saying, "Oh, lo siento, no habla inglés." All right? Or I could point her in the exact opposite direction to where she's going, or I could just give her the proper directions, which I did. Now, most normal people will know what to do in that situation. You know what the right and wrong decision is, right? But wisdom is knowing what to do with the other 90% of our situations in life where there are no clear-cut moral imperatives. And the reason wisdom is so important is because we can make decisions in life that are not morally wrong, but are actually damaging. All right? So the fool is the person who constantly is hurting themselves or others by their dumb choices in life. Maybe not morally wrong, but just dumb. And in our passage today, Job outlines for us the importance of wisdom when handling suffering. So for the last 2 weeks, we've been looking at how at the various tools that the person of Job, the man Job, employs to try and get through this time of horrible affliction that he's been going through. And how do the how question of suffering is, how do I get through this time? And what we've learned is it's through receiving comfort. We saw that 2 weeks ago. Then last week, it's from feeling God's presence, all right, a sense of God's presence. It's from understanding that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger, spiritually speaking, and it is through hope for the future. Now, the fifth and final tool that Job gives us for handling suffering is wisdom. Job 28 kind of stands out in the book of Job. It is the apex of Job's discourse with his three friends, and he just jumps in and he outlines the immense importance of wisdom when dealing with suffering. And I've got 3 points today, as your sermon outline shows, to help us unpack this amazing passage on wisdom. So, Job 28 starts by outlining how incredibly valuable wisdom is. I've titled that The Importance of Wisdom. But we're then told that although wisdom is profoundly important, it cannot actually be found on this planet. And I've titled this The Inaccessibility of Wisdom. Thankfully, Job concludes by sharing us where wisdom can be found, and I've titled that The Source of Wisdom. And like last week's topic, if we have wisdom already packed and ready to go when suffering arrives, then we will be in the best place possible to be able to handle that suffering. So please come with me as we look at where true wisdom is found. And our passage comes smack bang in the middle of Job's final speech, where he interjects this little passage here. It's kind of like an excursus on what he's talking about. And he does this to show the ultimate answer to how to handle suffering. But it begins in a really weird way. He's talking about mining of all things. And the point of verses 1 to 11 is to highlight how if humans want something badly enough, we will go to incredible lengths to get it. So humans have long coveted gold and silver and iron and jewels, and we have gone to incredible lengths to find them. So you see this in verse 4. Far from human dwellings, they cut a shaft. In places untouched by human feet, far from other people, they dangle and sway. Now, these days, we're a little more sophisticated when it comes to mining. We don't just dig shafts and hang on old ropes. Let me introduce to you, Angie's going to put this up behind us. This is the bucket excavator known as Badger 293. This is the largest land vehicle ever built. It stands at over 95 metres tall, weighs 14,200 tonnes, took over 5 years to build and costs $100 million. And it's used in one of Germany's coal mines. It does the equivalent of about 40, each day it does the equivalent of 40,000 miners with 10,000 dump trucks. That's how far humans are willing to go to find that which is precious. Thanks, Ange. Job's point is, wisdom is even more important than this. It's even more important than coal or iron or gold or diamond. The writer of Proverbs just comes straight out and says it. So this is Proverbs 3:13. Blessed are those who find wisdom, those who gain understanding, for she is more profitable than silver and yields better returns than gold. And then Proverbs 4:7, get wisdom, though it cost all you have, get understanding. And the reason wisdom is so important is because it helps us navigate the complexities of life. Now, let me say that again, because this is the pivot on which our whole topic for today hangs. Wisdom is understanding that life is complex, and wisdom is understanding how to navigate those complexities. All right? Foolishness is thinking life is simple. Because if you think life is simple, then you'll come up with very simple solutions to life's problems, and you will end up doing more damage than good. Right? So even if we are trying to do the right thing in life, unless we understand that life is complex, we can do enormous damage. So let me give you some examples. Take poverty as an example. Right? Progressives believe that poverty is the result of oppression. They think the reason people are poor is because the rich have been exploiting them. Now, the problem with such a simple diagnosis is it results in simple solutions. Progressives think the way we deal with poverty and lift people out of poverty is just by throwing money at them. But why then do the majority of lotto winners go bankrupt within a few years? That is not the right solution. Conservatives, on the other hand, are just as naive. Conservatives think poverty stems from laziness or a lack of personal initiative. And the solution, according to conservatives, is to just tell people to get off their backsides and work harder. And that too can do enormous damage to families. How about another example? Crime. Right? Progressives think crime too stems from oppression and a lack of opportunities in life. And because progressives don't want to be seen as oppressing the downtrodden, many progressive cities in the United States right now are just letting criminals off for things like shoplifting or armed robbery. They bring them in, they process them, straight back out into the community. And what that has led to is massive crime waves. And that has then led to big businesses just pulling out of those areas because they cannot afford to continue to lose money like that. And so the people who are really oppressed, not the criminals, but the poor, they are suffering immensely. The conservatives, they think crime is due to greed and wickedness, and so they focus on retributive justice, punishment, rather than rehabilitation alongside it. And we wonder why almost half of ex-prisoners reoffend within the first 2 years of being released. Now, why am I giving you these examples? I'm trying to show that if we think life is really simple, we come up with damaging solutions to those problems. And that's Job's point in verses 1 to 11. As precious as gold and silver and iron and gems are, humans should be going to even greater lengths than Badger 293 to get wisdom. We need to understand that life is complex and how to navigate those complexities, or we will just end up hurting others and ourselves like the fool does. So that's the importance of wisdom. Job then says something incredibly deflating, and that is that wisdom cannot be found in this world. Have a look at verse 12 over the page. But where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? No mortal comprehends its worth. It cannot be found in the land of the living. The deep says it's not in me. The sea says it's not with me. It cannot be bought with finest gold, nor can its price be weighed out in silver. Now, you might be tempted to think, well, this is simply rhetoric, but it's not. He's not saying wisdom is hard to find. Verse 13 says wisdom cannot be found in the land of the living. What he means is humans cannot discern for ourselves the complexities of this life. Now, the reason for that is because if there is no God out there, no creator, then there's no cosmic standard as to what's right or wrong. There's no divine benchmark as to what is good or bad. Right? Morality just becomes a matter of opinion. And what this means is any society that doesn't base itself on a religious benchmark, it doesn't matter which religion it is, but if you are a secular society, then what will happen is that society will begin to tear itself apart by arguing over what is good or bad. And that's what's happening in the West right now. All Western countries are presently tearing themselves apart in these culture wars because we're trying to figure out, well, what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, what is moral, what is immoral. And the reason we're doing that is because wisdom cannot be found in the land of the living. So I'll give you some examples of this. Take human philosophies, for example. Why is it that pretty much every single human philosophy that has ever been published gets debunked within a few years of being published? Right? Now, philosophy comes from two Greek words, philo meaning love and Sophia meaning wisdom. So a philosophy is the love of wisdom. But every single philosopher who thinks they've cracked the recipe for life have instead shown themselves to be utter fools. I'll give you an example. Take the philosophy of skepticism. You know what skepticism means? Skepticism says we need to question everything. We need to be skeptical. We need to doubt everything. Well, okay then. I'm skeptical about skepticism. Yeah, you can't be skeptical about skepticism. You got to be skeptical about everything else. Really? What about deconstructionism? I'd like to deconstruct deconstructionism. Thank you very much. Oh, well, no, you can't deconstruct deconstructionism. We need to use deconstructionism to deconstruct everything else. Really? Nihilism. There's another human philosophy. Nihilism says nothing in all of existence has any meaning. Okay, what do you mean by that? Well, I mean nothing has any meaning. No, I heard what you said, but the words you used to explain nihilism don't have any meaning, so everything you just said is gobbledygook. Oh, okay, well the words nothing has any meaning, they have meaning, but everything else in existence doesn't have meaning. Really? But you know what the dumbest human philosophy is? It's postmodernism. Right? Postmodernism says we have the absolute dyed-in-the-wool truth. And the indisputable, incontrovertible, unquestionable truth is there is no truth. Right. So the statement, there is no truth, is not true then. Oh, well, you just said there's no truth. Yeah, okay. Well, that statement's true, but everything else is not true. Really? And this is our big problem in life. Even the greatest thinkers and philosophers in history look like complete morons when it comes to wisdom. Why? Because searching for wisdom, digging for wisdom, tunneling for wisdom just doesn't work. It's because wisdom cannot be found in the land of the living. Right, well, Job has first told us that wisdom is of pivotal importance when navigating life's complexities. But second, Job has just declared this essential, fundamental, critical wisdom is nowhere to be found on the planet. Kind of makes for a bit of a downer sermon, doesn't it? Well, thankfully, Job gives us a third point to this sermon in verses 23 to 28. Phew. And that third point is that although wisdom is hidden from every living thing, verse 21, God knows the way to it. Verse 23. Right? So if you think you can figure wisdom out, then you are every bit as much of a fool as those human philosophers are who come up with self-contradictory philosophies. Right? The truth is there is no truth. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. But if you realize God has wisdom, then you can find your way to where wisdom dwells. Verse 23. Think about it this way. What does Hamlet know about Shakespeare? That's a weird question, but Hamlet is a character in one of Shakespeare's plays. And if you were to ask Hamlet, what do you know about Shakespeare? The answer would be, I'd never even heard of Shakespeare. Right? The only way Hamlet can know anything about Shakespeare is if Shakespeare includes information about himself in his play so that Hamlet can understand that. All right? Now, in the same way, if wisdom cannot be found in the land of the living, then the only way you and I can find wisdom is if the creator of the land of the living has written it into our life somehow. And thankfully, he has. And the Bible tells us several things about wisdom. So firstly, it tells us about suffering, the wisdom of suffering. And what it tells us about suffering is that suffering is complex, just like life is complex. So Job's three friends, they gave us a very worldly view of suffering, a very one-dimensional view of suffering. They think if you reap suffering, it's because you've sowed it yourself. The Bible gives us a multi-dimensional view of suffering, not a one-dimensional view of suffering. So let me explain. To begin with, the Bible tells us that God created the world to work according to his righteousness. Now, what that means is if we go against his righteousness, i.e. if we sin, then we're going against the very fabric of reality. And that has consequences. You put your hands in the fire, you're going to get burnt, right? So, for example, if you lie or steal or cheat, people will stop trusting you. If you commit adultery, your marriage will fall apart, all right? If you gossip, people will stop confiding in you. There are real consequences to sinning. And that's what Job's three friends were getting at. But the Bible's more complex than that when it comes to suffering. That's not all it says about suffering. It also tells us that when Adam and Eve sinned, God cursed his creation, the environment. And so it doesn't work in our favor anymore. And so sometimes suffering may be due to natural disasters like earthquakes or tsunamis or bushfires or floods. But the Bible gets more complex than that about suffering. When we hear about Joseph. Now, Joseph was his father's favorite son, and that favoritism was leading Joseph to become an entitled, spoiled, obnoxious little brat who would tell on his brothers so that he would look good. And so God sold Joseph into slavery for 7 years. He was someone else's property for 7 years, and then he went to jail for another 7 years. And that 14 years of suffering transformed Joseph into one of the greatest leaders ever, who saved more people than any other human in history, save for Jesus. But the Bible is even more complex than that when it comes to suffering. In John chapter 9, the disciples asked Jesus whether a man born blind was born blind and suffered blindness because he sinned or because his parents sinned. And Jesus says it actually has nothing to do with sin, this man's suffering. He has been suffering blindness so that the works of God might be displayed in him. John 9 verse 3. But the Bible is even more complex than that when it comes to suffering. We learned this in 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul says the reason some of the Corinthians were getting sick or had even died was because they were misusing the Lord's Supper. So according to the Bible, some people are suffering as a direct punishment of their sin. And so the first thing that God's word teaches us about suffering is that suffering is multidimensional. It's complex. The second thing it tells us is that we humans do not have the capacity to understand these complexities. We might know the information, but we can't navigate that very well. We are like infants when it comes to understanding the complexities of this life and the complexities of suffering. So I'll give you an example. When my eldest was 18 months old, he contracted an acute gastro bug. And because he couldn't keep any fluids in, we had to hospitalise him. And my first job as his father, when I arrived there, was to help hold my little man down while the doctors poked and prodded him with needles. And he just looked at me, screaming and in tears, as if to say, "Daddy, please make them stop." But he couldn't speak. And he couldn't understand what was going on. And I desperately wanted to explain to him why he was suffering, but I couldn't. The reason being, infants just have a different order of reality to parents, don't they? And I had to allow that suffering to continue so they could rehydrate my child. Now, if you multiply the difference in reality between a toddler and a parent by about 1 billion, that's how much difference there is between our understanding of reality and God's understanding of reality. And this is why you and I, we just don't have the capacity as feeble humans to grasp all the complexities of suffering in this life. So what do? Well, third and final thing that the Bible teaches us about the wisdom of suffering comes in verse 28. Job 28:28 should be a memory verse. And he, God, said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil, that is understanding. Right? If the complexities of suffering are too much for our feeble human minds to comprehend, then the only thing to do when suffering hits is to fear the Lord and to shun evil. Now, to shun evil, that has to do with morality, okay? Do not let your suffering give you permission to think you can just go and sin. All that's going to do is result in more suffering for you because you are going against the very fabric of reality. If you put your hand in the fire, you're going to get burnt, all right? We have to stay obedient to the Lord in our suffering. But shunning evil isn't enough. We also need to fear the Lord. Now, what does it mean to fear the Lord? It does mean being scared, but it's more than being scared. So what do I mean by being scared? In The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, when Mr. Beaver is asked if Aslan is safe, Mr. Beaver says, he's a lion. Of course he's not safe, but he's good, I tell you. So fear means there is this healthy level of respect we have for what God can do with his power, but it also includes an element of awe and wonder. That's what it means to fear the Lord. We need to stand in awe and wonder of his beauty and his goodness to us. Now, how does that play out? Well, when suffering comes, we can either get really anxious or really angry at how God's not doing the right thing, or we can remember that the distance between an 18-month-old and a parent is nowhere near the distance between our understanding of reality and God's understanding of reality. He sees everything. And so to fear the Lord in the midst of suffering means to have a crazy level of trust in God's love, even when it feels like he's abandoned us. And it is that trust that actually makes us a better person, a stronger person, a more mature Christian. Right? Just like when you put coal under pressure, it turns into a diamond. So too, when you put a Christian under pressure, it can turn their faith into a precious diamond. If we trust in God's love. Now, the beauty for us Christians is we have even more reason to trust in God's love than Job did. And that's because God didn't just write wisdom into our world. He wrote himself into our world. See, Job didn't know that God was going to come into our world in the form of a man to suffer for our sake. But we know that. Right? Job only had the promise of God's unconditional love. We have the proof. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. And friends, when we focus on Jesus being obedient through suffering for our sake, it strengthens us to be obedient through suffering for his sake. So, brothers and sisters, the number one tool in handling suffering is to understand that we don't understand suffering. But our job is to trust God anyway. What does that mean? It means to say something like, look, I'm in pain, Lord. I really don't like this suffering. I want it to end. I can't wait for it to end. I don't understand why you're not letting it end. But I understand that you see the whole picture when I don't. And so while I wait, thy will be done. I'm going to trust you and obey you. Friends, if we can do that, not only does it help us get through our times of affliction, it helps us become even better Christians for it. But God has said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding.